Hello there, welcome to Test Automation Framework Development Series. This is the first video in this series. By end of this series, you should be able to understand what framework is, how should we think about the framework development, and if you follow along on your machine, you will have hands-on experience of building test automation framework. My objective is trying to make a video series which is beginner friendly, aiming to give confidence that anyone can develop framework if they have a programming skills, and that's it. So let's get into our first video, framework one-on-one. So after watching this video, you will learn what the framework word mean in general. Framework word can mean different thing in different contexts. We will see an example about it. Why do we need a framework in the first place? What are the different kind of software frameworks out there, and how these terms is generally referenced in software development? Test automation framework, obviously the main intention, and how to learn test automation framework, and points to consider while developing the framework. So let's go to our next slide. So target audience for this video or this series is someone who has less than 3 years of experience in software testing, who has never worked on more than one framework, and someone interested in a test automation framework. If you have more experience or work on more than one framework, you probably may not learn something new. So I recommend you to not watch this series at all, if you have work, because I'm trying to keep it beginner friendly and wanted to give a confidence to the folks that if you have really good knowledge of programming, then you can definitely learn the skill of developing the framework. Okay, now let's understand what the framework word mean in general. As I said, in different contexts, framework word would mean different thing, and I'm trying to define it in a general way. What it would gives, what we should relate to when anyone said the framework. Obviously, as an QA engineer, whenever we hear the word framework, we refer it to the test automation framework. But in general, framework word mean a lot of things from a different context. Like in project management, there are a lot of frameworks that they use about shipping the different kind of things. There is marketing frameworks, there are go to market frameworks. Even in software development, we use Scrum is a framework that how should we do our software development, what how should we manage that process. And let's see. So essentially framework is like a supporting structure which other things are built on top of. So, and a framework is like an established set of a principle or guidelines that can be followed in order to achieve the goals or objective. Obviously you have to have goals or objective, and depending upon that goals and objective you would choose the framework, right? So the, as I said, right, or depending on the context it would mean a different thing. So first principle thinking is something that people use generally while solving a problem, right? So this came into the limelight when Elon Musk talked about it, how he solved the problem in SpaceX and Tesla. And the Scrum framework, which I touched base earlier, that something that we use. It's a framework. It provides a structure, and we follow it to achieve our goal of a product development or get to that software deliverables. The very simple example that I'm thinking I can come up with is like a map. If it's a kind of a framework, because it provides a structure, and it helps us achieve the goal. It helps us from one place to another place, and it provides us a plan, right? So suppose I wanted to go from Pune to Gokarn. Map gives me particular structure, guidelines, where can I refuel my vehicle. So map is a kind of a framework, right? Okay, I hope you understand what the framework would mean in general, and now try to understand why do we need a framework in the first place. So I'll go and give an example of four things that I think of. Obviously, we can write it down in detail that, like 5 points or whole deck on why do we need a framework on itself, but I'm trying to keep it simple for you. Framework is kind of a system to govern a process or diffusion, right? What I mean by that, as I said, right, first principle thinking framework or product frameworks. So if you just use this product framework as a phase, and you would see like there are so many product frameworks out there that one can learn from, and that there is like product template, North Star framework, ICE theory, and all these are like a product framework that product owner, product manager can use to develop a product, right? So again, the context is you want a system to govern the process or diffusion, right? The another example that I can recall, long ago, when there is when people used to think about EQ and IQ and how can you come, try to work on your EQ. So there were like a three set of a questionnaire that I found on Twitter, that you need to ask yourself, uh, does this need to be said? Does this need to be said by me? And does this need to be said by me now? Right? So if you wanted to use your emotional quotient, so that's kind of a system or that can help us to come to that diffusion using that question. So it's kind of a framework of a sort, right? To have a structure that provide an abstraction and remove the complexities. This is like very come close to our home run. Like, whenever we write an automation, we want our test to run in parallel, in distributed mode. We want different browser to be, but we hide that complexity somewhere else, and our test just define the user journeys and try to, validate particular thing that we are interested in, instead of, every test have that work needs to be done about parallel execution, distributed execution. So so framework does support, provide that abstraction and remove that complexity to, focus on the main core that we wanted to achieve. Obviously it provides the guidelines, standard rules that everyone can follows in the team, and most of the time framework enforces them. In software there are also some kind of a framework which are called opinionated framework that people can pick and use that they like, but most of the framework have some kind of rules and they enforce them. Also, very importantly, we talked about earlier video, earlier slide. If you see, we saw these two words that were highlighted: structure and followed. So so if you think about that, structure is what we talked about, but the flow is also important, right? It also provide a flow or direction about the sequence of an action. So I'll explain this with an example of a Scrum, right? In Scrum we use this iterative development model where we have like in 2 weeks or 3 weeks sprints, and we have a backlog, and we do have like a particular flow that we product owner creates product backlog, then there is a development team who does sprint planning, then there is a sprint backlog, actual sprint, we deliver the software, there is a retrospective, there is a sprint demos, and again, the whole cycle. So there is a flow also provided by the frameworks. Even if you take a very simple example of a map, you can relate, right, that from where we have to go and where we can reach. Map provides us that kind of a flow where, so it's very simple. Two things that when you need to understand when anyone thinks about a framework. One is it provides structure, and other is in flow, right? So let's talk about the software frameworks. What are the software frameworks and what we need to understand about them, right? So software framework is a set of libraries, tools. So libraries and tools are like a bit different word. There is a whole lot of debate and a lot of blog spot about how to define them. We are not going to go into it, but it's like a convention for building and deploying the application. Obvious thing. It provides a structure that helps developers build organized code as well as a common set of APIs. The earlier example that we talked about, like coming to the diffusion, reaching to the particular destination. But when it comes to the software development, it's providing structure to our code, how can particular APIs be used, and those kind of a structure, right? And uh, it can also have the guidelines for deployment and uh, programming and maintaining the software, right? One thing is not mentioned here is an Hollywood principle, which like some of the uh, some of the framework enforces, not all but most of them, that software design principle stated as don't call us, we call you, right? So most of the time, even in our automation, our framework actually call our script that we write to cover the end-to-end scenario, instead of we are calling the framework, right? So if we are using a test engines library, that basically test runner calls our tests. If you use a spring development framework, there is something, there is an already there, you just write the other code which fills the detail, which is very uh, relevant to our application or business that we wanted to write into the code. So that is how it is. And other things is like frameworks do the calling and we don't call the framework. So that is other thing that you need to keep in mind when someone speak about the software framework. Obviously it's not like highlight it, but if see the many framework, you would see that would be the pattern, that we don't call the framework, from framework calls us. Okay. And the rail, like as I said, right, there are like popular different frameworks including .NET, Ruby on Rails, and AngularJS, like a platform framework, uh, web development framework, front end framework. So these are like a different kind of a framework even in software development, and we have not even started talking about even test automation frameworks. So now let's talk about test automation framework, right? So the objective of a test automation framework is to provide a fast feedback about the most use cases, reduce feedback cycle time, and thus freeing testers to do exploratory testing more. So this is what I think the why we should think about test automation framework. They're like, if you go on a Google and try to search why we need a test automation framework, you would find like hundred of work with like hundreds of different reasons, and those are correct too, but we don't have to go into the details. We all within common sense understand why it's important and why we need to do it. But what if you ask me, I think two important thing: we need to reduce feedback cycle time from our frequent use cases so that we can free to do the exploratory testing more. uh, Test automation framework obviously provides structure for organizing and execution test cases, as well as for reporting and analyzing the test result. And a test automation framework can help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of a testing, as it allows to reuse the code resources to easily update and maintain the test suite as the application changes, right? So that is what the test automation framework is supposed to do. So how to learn test automation framework? So before we go into our next video in this series, where we start with like our first script and then see all the evolution. So so this is like my personal take about how to learn test automation framework. Obviously, common advice is like do the tutorials or do the project where they provide a real time hands-on experience, and read a blogs or do the projects. But it's really hard if just doing exploratory kind of a testing, and there are like set of practices in your organization where you don't get exposed to a real-time project, and just studying the tutorial you are not able to see that gain. How can you develop the framework or get that confidence? There are like also like 50-60 hours tutorials out there on Udemy which claims to make you master in test automation framework, but honestly it's just one way of developing the framework, and just watching you 60 hours tutorials won't give you that kind of a confidence. So to really have that confidence, you at least try to develop a two or three different kind of a framework which cater different kind of a needs. Obviously most of the frameworks do look like very similar, because the intent is same, right? Why we develop a test automation framework, but it doesn't mean that you have to do exactly same way what you see over here on a YouTube or see on a Udemy. You should think about your product, uh, kind of a needs, set up that context, and then think about developing it, right? So this is the common advice. And truth is, if you wanted to development framework, you would need a good hold on a programming language. So in this series, we're gonna focus on Java and Selenium because it's widely used and people can easily, get into that because a lot of material also available. Uh, but if you don't know programming language and you wanted to do the test automation framework, it's like, you don't know the walking, but you wanted to, get into the marathon. You won't be able to do that because you need to learn to walk first, have that balance, then you would, start running, practicing, and eventually you would go into the marathon. So you would need a good hold on, programming language, and that's the truth. If you don't think you don't have that knowledge, you need to go and brush up. Do you need to be a programming ninja? No, definitely not. You don't need to know like an all languaging feature. That's absurd. No one knows that, and it's okay to Google a lot of things out. But you need to have that confidence. If it's an just a programming language problem, you should be able to figure it out. It also depends on person to person level. Some may be able to figure it out in a 2 minutes. Some maybe take 20 minutes. So that's all right. But it's truth. Test automation framework development is like any, or even writing a test scripts is like not very different than writing an actually code from shipping the product, right? You use the same kind of a language, you use the same kind of syntax, you use the same kind of deployment strategies and platform, so it's not different. So you think that I am not gonna code it, so you should focus on that, right? But I'm trying to make sure that this video is having to the beginners friendly, so if you have decent knowledge, you should be good to watch and follow along. You should also understand the clean code practices. So what is clean code? So there is an famous book by the uh, Uncle Bob, clean code book. So I'll recommend you to highly recommend you to read it. Robert Martin, generally referred as an Uncle Bob in programming community. It's like very well received by the programmer, and it's give about a thought process how we should think about developing a software. So you should understand. If you don't get have patience to read the books, try to understand what that book teaches us by looking at watching different videos or reading the blogs. But I think it's some of the like an core thing one should think about if they really wanted to get into the automation framework. If you write a script, it's like a small piece unit which can run in isolation. It won't impact others. But if you think about test automation framework, it's like you are setting up an guidelines and things that others can reuse, right? So you are creating an API, you are providing that abstraction. So whatever you write had to be top notch and production get quality. So you need to understand this clean code practices. There are there are like standards how we should think about how we should write our object oriented code, and these like two are like very widely used principles: solid and kiss. So if you just google it out, you will able to find it out. Keep it simple, silly. Solid stand from there is a big acronym norm for solid. I'm not gonna go into it right now, so you can just google it and try to find it out. There are also courses just around the solid, right? So standalone, open, and other things that needs to be covered. So how should you write your object oriented code? So you need to understand basics of it. It's not like you would need it every now and then, but if you know this, the kind of test that you would write, it would definitely be better and look like very professional. Okay. Design patterns. Yes, what is design patterns, how that we need to use it, why it need to be used. Eventually you will learn it, and it may happen that you are using it but you are unaware of what is that design pattern called it. But if you read some books, so Gangs of Four is one of the highly recommended books for designs of patterns, uh, design patterns. But if you know them earlier before you start doing this, better. If you need to start looking at it while you start developing the test automation framework. My deck, if you joining a company and you have worked on one particular framework, and now you were exposed to another framework and you wanted to learn the other framework or any framework or just a test automation framework development. So my take is in kind of like in common sense. It's like, understand and go through many framework possible on GitHub, because that will give you confidence generally how the frameworks are developed and what is the industry standard and how people have been developing the frameworks. Obviously these are like open source framework, may not be used in real project, but it will give you slightly good idea than not looking at all, right? And obviously most people who do this, they are professional working, and it comes very close to what they might be using in real project. So what you will understand by looking at this framework skeleton, like what are the project structure, and as I said, right, different framework may have different folder structure, different skeleton, how they are exposing API, how they are hiding the complexity, providing the abstraction, right? How they providing the reusable code, the flow of the execution, as I said, right? The framework generally provides the flow of execution. So where the execution start, what are the bootstrapping thing that happens before actually execute the script, and it also will provide, if it's very overwhelming for you, you should create a flow diagram for an execution, and that will give you the idea, okay, how should I think about a framework in general, right? So that is how you can learn the test automation framework. Obviously, in this series, what we will do, we will start with one single script, one sample demo app, and from there onwards we will try adding more script, and we will see evolution of a framework, right? So framework is like a living entity, or any product that you might be currently working on. It's never complete, it's evolve over the time, it would evolve. It's not like at one day someone sits and write down the whole framework. They just do right bare minimum thing that needs to be done as a first thing, and eventually framework gets built, right? So as I mentioned, points to consider while developing the framework, right? uh, Treat like any other production application, understand the AAA. So AAA stand for arrange, act, assert. So it's kind of an industry standard. So generally any test come, we can define the test in this format. You need to arrange, suppose you are doing the login, then you need to be on a login page, navigation, and then test data should be there. Then you act, you provide the credentials and click on the button, and assert whether login is successful or not successful depending upon the data. So you need to understand and establish the pattern and think about it in deeper level. You need to start small, as I said in the last minute back, that you need to start small. Remember, framework will evolve, it's never complete, it's kind of a living entity, it will always evolve. No one writes a framework like the first thing. So if you just wrote couple of, provided an encapsulation and abstraction for couple of script, that's also fine, that's also framework. And no two framework has to be same and provide the same kind of a functionality, right? And then if once you evolve the framework, you should think about the capabilities that you need to build in your framework. Generally from a test automation framework, people think about how can they add a support for a web API, mobile, then reporting becomes core part, then there is a test data generation that you wanted to use, uh, test selection for execution. Often you have to just execute subset of a test cases and not all the cases at once. So how can you define that subset, because it's only the particular functionality might have been impacted and you need to run the test against that. So that parallel execution, CI/CD integration, distributed execution, different kind of logs, and screenshot, snapshot, and video recording. These are like lot of capabilities that one can think about in general framework, and obviously we can talk about them in depth, but this is like an introduction video where you just need to know what other things can be talked about or thought about when we think about the framework development. So that's it for today. The idea is you learn what the framework is uh, in general without context, with context to the software development and then test automation development, and how should we go about doing the things. Most important thing that you should take away from this video: first is skeleton, second is a flow of an execution, that's like a very important thing. Third thing that I'll ask you to remember is start small. Remember, framework will evolve, it's a living entity, it's not like that something is completed, right? So even if you have added all these capabilities, someone might, instead of you are doing this API testing on HTTP, someone thinks, okay, now we wanted to do it on a WebSocket. How can you provide the support for a WebSocket in your framework? So you have to evolve your frameworks, try to find out how you can do that. Right now, I said parallel and distributed execution, but you might be doing that in-house on in your setup infrastructure, but you wanted to do it with provider like source lab or browser stack, then you may have to enable that in your framework. So it's not complete. I worked on, in my previous company where i I had to upload result on AWS. So that is not mentioned over here. That was part of that framework because that was the need. It has to be exposed to the customer result and those. So that is how it is. So we will start small. We will always keep in mind that it's supposed to provide a skeleton and flow, and it will evolve as we go along. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Thank you for watching this. I hope to see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.